It began on a gray morning in Washington, D.C., the kind of morning when the marble pillars of the federal courthouse seemed to lean forward, waiting to witness history. Reporters crowded the steps, their breath visible in the cold air, microphones raised toward the heavy oak doors. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a quiet tension because in a few moments, the judges of the Federal Circuit Court were about to decide the fate of one of the most powerful economic weapons ever used by a U.S. President. Donald J. Trump had always seen tariffs not as mere taxes, but as tools of dominance buttons he could press to reshape the global playing field. From Beijing to Berlin, from Ottawa to Seoul, his global tariff wave had sent shockwaves through trade markets. He called them Liberation Day tariffs, claiming they would free America from unfair deals and punish nations that took advantage of U.S. workers. Factories once quiet began humming again, at least for a time. His supporters called it economic patriotism. His critics called it chaos. But in this courtroom, slogans meant nothing. What mattered was law. The lead attorney for the plaintiffs, a calm, gray-haired man representing a coalition of small businesses, stood before the bench. His clients were toy importers, auto part dealers, coffee roasters, small companies that had been crushed under sudden kurang 20 and 30% tariffs they could neither predict nor afford. Your Honors, he sighed softly, this is not about politics. It is about power. Who has the right to impose a tax on the American people? Across from him, government lawyers defended the administration's moves as acts of national emergency. They argued that under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, the president could restrict trade when the country was under threat and that economic exploitation by foreign powers was a threat. The judges listened, stone-faced. Then the chief judge, a woman known for her sharp intellect, leaned forward. Counsel, she asked, show us where in the statute it says a president can impose tariffs. The lawyer hesitated, shuffled papers, and offered a broad interpretation of regulating commerce. The judge's eyes narrowed. Regulating is not taxing, she sighed. The room fell silent. Everyone in that courtroom knew what that meant. Hours later, when the decision was read aloud, the words landed like thunder. The court ruled that none of Trump's tariffs were illegal, that the president had exceeded his authority, stretching an emergency law beyond its limits. The power to impose tariffs, the court wrote, belongs to Congress, not the White House. It was a stunning rebuke, not just of a policy, but of a philosophy, the idea that one man could reshape the global economy with a signature. The news spread like wildfire. Within minutes, cable networks flashed the headline, U.S. Court strikes down Trump's global tariffs. Markets jolted. In New York, traders refreshed their screens. In Beijing, officials met behind closed doors. In Brussels, diplomats whispered that the American legal system had just done what years of negotiation could not. It had stopped the trade war in its tracks. Inside the White House, aides rushed into the Oval Office. Trump was watching television, jaw clenched, his phone already lighting up with messages. He slammed his palm on the desk. They can't do that, he growled. I'm the president. We had to protect our people. Within minutes, he opened his social media app and posted in capital letters, all tariffs are still in effect. Total witch hunt. The post went viral instantly. But behind the bluster, his advisors were panicking. The ruling didn't just invalidate a few tariffs, it potentially opened the door to billions of dollars in refunds. Treasury officials warned that half the tariff revenue collected over the past 2 years might have to be returned to importers. The Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, privately admitted, if we pay it all back, it could get our reserves. Yet ignoring the ruling would trigger a constitutional crisis. Across the nation, reactions split along familiar lines. Trump supporters took to rallies, waving flags and chanting, America first forever. They claimed the court was full of globalist judges, business owners. Meanwhile, breathed a cautious sigh of relief. In a small warehouse in Ohio, a toy importer named Vanessa Levy stared at the verdict on her laptop. For months, she had been forced to raise prices, losing customers. Maybe, she sighed quietly, we get our lives back. Foreign leaders responded carefully. China's Ministry of Commerce called the decision a positive step toward fairness. European officials said it showed the resilience of American democracy. But analysts knew this was more than a legal skirmish. It was a battle over who controls the levers of the world's largest economy. In Congress, the ruling reignited a decades-old debate. Lawmakers who had once stayed silent now demanded clarity. Should presidents be allowed to invoke national emergencies to reshape trade policy? Some senators proposed rewriting EAPA to prevent any future misuse. Others, especially Trump loyalists, promised to restore his authority through new legislation. The Capitol buzzed with political electricity because everyone sensed that the balance of power had just shifted. Meanwhile, economists scrambled to calculate the fallout. The tariffs had raised consumer prices, strained alliances, and disrupted supply chains, but they had also boosted domestic steel and manufacturing jobs. If the tariffs vanished overnight, could those gains collapse? Some experts predicted a short-term market dip but long-term stability. Others warned of chaos if refunds flooded but unpredictably. For ordinary Americans, the story felt distant yet familiar, another twist in the ongoing drama of power, law, and personality. But for small businesses, it was deeply personal. In Texas, a man who imported machine parts said, "When the tariffs hit, my margins disappeared. Now maybe we can hire again." In California, a coffee roaster whispered, "We just want consistency. We can handle rules but not surprises." As the dust settled, attention turned to one final battlefield, the Supreme Court. The Trump administration filed an emergency appeal, asking the justices to reinstate the tariffs while the case proceeded. Legal scholars called it the biggest separation of powers showdown since Watergate. Would the court side with executive power or reform Congress's authority? The stakes were immense: billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, and the precedent that could define how presidents use emergency laws in the future. Behind the scenes, lobbying intensified. Corporations, unions, and the foreign embassies flooded Washington with position papers. Talk shows turned it into spectacle. Social media amplified every rumor. But away from the noise, in law schools and the boardrooms, people recognized something profound. This wasn't only about Trump. It was about the outer limits of presidential power in the modern age, an age where economics had become a weapon as potent as missiles. Weeks later, the Supreme Court announced it would hear the case in November. Commentators dubbed it tariff-free democracy. Cameras lingered on the courthouse steps once again. For the second time in a year, the nation would watch 9 justices decide whether emergency authority had been stretched beyond recognition. And somewhere far from the cameras, in the quiet offices of small-town America, business owners waited, calculators in hand, dreams on pause. For them, this wasn't ideology, it was survival. Whether the ruling stood or fell could determine if they reopened or closed forever. Trump, meanwhile, doubled down on his narrative. At a rally in Pennsylvania, he told a roaring crowd that the deep state wanted to strip America of its right to defend itself economically. "They can't stop US," he shouted, the crowd chanting his name. But even as he spoke, legal advisors whispered that if the Supreme Court upheld the ruling, the tariffs would have to be dismantled, refunds issued, and a fundamental pillar of his trade agenda erased. Night fell on Washington once again, the city glowing gold under the dome of the Capitol. In the distance, the Supreme Court stood silent, its marble steps reflecting the light. Inside, clerks reviewed briefs, knowing they were preparing for a case that could echo through decades. For the first time in years, the global trading system waited on AU's courtroom rather than the Oval Office. Allies and the rivals alike watched, wondering whether America's promise of checks and balances still meant something in practice. And in homes across the country, people scrolled through the news on their phones, reading about tariffs, refunds, and legal battles, trying to decide what it all meant. To some, it was just another headline. To others, it was proof that even the most powerful must answer to the law. Because in the end, this story wasn't only about economics or politics. It was about a principle older than any trade deal, that in a democracy, #1, no matter how loud, how popular, or how defiant is about the law. When the Supreme Court finally rules, history will remember more than numbers and the tariffs. It will remember whether the country reaffirmed that principle or let it slip away in the noise of power. And as the sun rises over the Capitol, painting the courthouse steps in polygold, America waits once again for justice, for clarity, and for the next chapter in its endless struggle between authority and the accountability.